They got good Wi-Fi.
And, you can ask him that in just a second. So,
We ready?
we are ready. I'm about to turn you over to them.
Okay.
There you go.
Kidding.
Morning, how are you all?
Good morning.
So, as Mr. Garrett said, my name is Jeffrey Bibbee. I'm a professor of history at UNA. And typically this time of year, I would be just down the street on campus in Florence. But as you can tell from what's behind me, even though the last class thought it was a green screen, and this was all fake, I'm actually not in Florence at all. So can anybody tell me where I am? More specifically, what building is behind me, you know?
Parliament building.
Yeah, it's the Houses of Parliament. So this building actually dates from 1834. There was a huge fire that burned the Palace of Westminster to the ground, and it had to be rebuilt. But on this site, really since the Middle Ages, Britain's representative democracy has met, and it still meets there today. And right now it's out of session, so things are a little bit quiet around here, thankfully. Though it's possible in cameras for the major media outlets are going to set up. Because what you don't see is this is actually the spot where like the BBC does their live link if they're talking about politics or something like that. So if they all show up in a few minutes, I may have to move. Hoping that doesn't happen, but there's been a steady stream of people behind me all day. So we'll see how this goes. The reason I'm in London right now is I'm on what's called a faculty development leave from UNA, which means I have a reduced teaching responsibility, and I'm spending the remainder of my time working on a research project. And I'm actually here with a group called the Georgian Papers Program, which is a joint project between King's College London, which is part of the University of London, the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. And they are digitizing the papers of the Hanoverian dynasty. So King George I, II, III, those folks. And George III fits very squarely with our topic today. This digitization project is taking place because the Royal Archives is actually quite tiny. It's in the castle, and since the castle is a true medieval castle, it's about 1,000 years old, it's hard to let a lot of visitors in, and so it's highly restricted on who can get in and see these papers. So we're digitizing them to make them available free of charge to the public. The role that I'm playing is I'm actually working with the team on how to make the archives more accessible to students like you and to your teachers like Mr. Garrett and others in Florence, Alabama, who may not have a chance to come visit London, that can still use primary resources in their classrooms from this database. So hopefully in the next year or so, more of these materials will be available online, and there'll be more materials available to your teachers on how they can use this. So it's actually part of a neat project that I'm getting to help with. Also part of this, I'll be leading a group of students from UNA to come to London this summer to be part of that project. I'll actually have a team of students that will work with me through the whole spring semester on this digitization project, and then they'll get to travel to London in May to actually meet the team and tour the archives and see the behind the scenes part of what they've been working on. But our topic is not much that. It's actually something a little more akin to what you've been talking about in your class. So as I understand it, it's American Revolution time in your coursework. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So why is the American Revolution important?
For y'all talk.
That's the part where you guys get to answer me. Why is it important? Why do we need to study it?
Jordan, go ahead.
It's the start of America.
Yeah, it's the beginnings of the United States of America. Absolutely. It's the origins of our history. So we have to understand where we've come from. Absolutely. What else?
It changed the world.
Oh,
How so? That's a great answer. I'm just going to ask you to unpack that.
I mean, it was kind of, not the first, but it was a colony that won its war for independence. And so it kind of showed the other colonies, like, you can too.
Yeah, inspiration inspiration is something that we never want to discount. So the American Revolution will be inspirational to the French Revolution, which you studied when you were in 8th grade. You've also maybe studied the Haitian Revolution and other South American revolutions over the next couple of weeks. These will be absolutely pivotal in the development of the Western Hemisphere, but they come in large part because of the inspiration of the American Revolution. And you know, we still hear the rhetoric of the American Revolution all the time in other revolutionary movements, even in the 21st century. So the ideas of liberty, justice, democracy, we see those coming up again and again and again, and you just turn on the news and watch the news. So you're absolutely right. It is an inspirational moment in world history. And one of the reasons for that is it's one of the first times where the ideas of the Enlightenment, things like freedom of speech, a trial by jury, freedom of the press, are going to be the motivations and will be articulated by the leaders of the revolution. And again, that's a big part of that inspiration. These ideas existed, and in large part, many European countries enjoyed those freedoms to some degree. But to have that be the motivation, not an economic war, not a political war, not a conquest for territory, but those ideals as a motivation will be extremely important. And then, has anybody heard the music from the musical Hamilton? Yeah. Nobody?
Yeah.
The fact that in the 21st century, somebody's writing a musical about Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, it still shows the power of the individuals that come out of the American Revolution. Madison, Jefferson, Franklin, of course, George Washington are all going to be well-known global figures, not just in the United States. Most people know who George Washington is, and they think of him as a great military leader, but also as an important political leader. So if the American Revolution is important to study for all those reasons, we also have to think about the fact that the American Revolution is a much more complex event than just a group of colonists deciding that they want to separate from Great Britain. Was everybody in the colonies on the side of the revolution?
No.
No. Now, obviously, we don't have opinion polls, so we don't know for certain. But it's pretty safe to say that it could even at times have been a 50-50 split, maybe even more people favoring remaining part of the broader British Empire than separating from Britain. But do you think that everybody in Britain was against the American Revolution? No, it's kind of interesting. If we think about the fact that the colonists themselves were split, some favoring fealty and remaining part of the British Empire, but some favoring independence. There's also an interesting split here in Britain too. People on both sides of that equation. And what's interesting is when we look at the arguments. Give me just a second. I'm going to be buzzing right around my face. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Sorry. That's the fun part about being outside. There's the same divisions here that we see back in the colonies. There are people who support independence and support the colonial revolutionary movement, and there are people who are against it. So let's think for a moment, what are some of the arguments in favor of the revolution? What's the big one that you always hear about? And I know you've heard about even before you got to Mr. Garrett's class.
There you go, say it.
Taxation without representation.
No taxation without representation. Absolutely. That's the big battle cry of the American Revolution. Now, what's fascinating, though, is when we think about that idea, I'm standing in front of a building and an institution that dates back to the Middle Ages. So why were the American colonists griping about a lack of representative democracy when Britain already had a representative democracy right here in the Houses of Parliament, right here in Westminster?
They weren't represented.
Did you hear that?
No, I couldn't hear it. So,
Eli?
They weren't properly represented.
They weren't properly represented, absolutely. There were no elected representatives from the colonies that sat in Parliament. Now, what's also interesting to remember, though, is that the vast majority of people in England itself would not have had representatives in Parliament, that they would have themselves elected. For the most part, people were disenfranchised. This is well before women have a right to vote. Actually, they're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the right of women to vote in this country just this year. But also, most people, most farmers, most regular laborers, factory workers, they would not have been voters. Voting was restricted to the upper classes, to the nobility. It was seen as something that was very much a privilege, and that landowners especially would have been the only people that would have had that right to vote. So it's kind of funny when we think about the American colonists complaining about a lack of representation. Most people in England would have also been kind of similarly treated, represented by other individuals, not individuals that they would have themselves voted for. What are some of the other arguments in favor of the American Revolution?
Something else.
Have
Okay.
you guys talked about like the Grenville Acts and the Stamp Act and the Intolerable Acts?
Yes.
What about those yesterday?
Yes.
Yes.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
We talked about those. Okay.
Yes.
So why is the British Parliament passing all of these taxes and all of this legislation onto the American colonies?
War debts.
War
They're
debt.
paying the bills. They're paying the bills for the French and Indian War, right?
Yes.
You guys talked about the French and Indian War.
Yes.
So there's an economic issue involved here, and the colonists are saying, why are we putting the bill for a war that we didn't want to fight? Why are we putting the bill for things that are not our responsibility? There's an economic decision here. Can you guys still see me?
Yes.
Okay, I can't see you anymore. That's okay. Maybe that'll come back in a minute. There's an economic consequence here. And a lot of people are concerned about the fact that the colonies are part of a much larger empire, and they're having to put the bill for things that are not directly related to their governance and to their upkeep. Now, the British would argue very differently and say these colonies were definitely part of the French and Indian War, and that their defense cost a lot, and so the colony should be part of paying for that. But that's always something we want to keep in mind is who is actually seeing their various responsibilities when it comes to understanding these economic issues. So what are some of the arguments against the American Revolution?
What if we fail?
What if we fail?
Sorry, say that again?
What if we fail?
Yeah, what if we fail? Absolutely. Now, there's two ways to look at that. One is, what are the consequences if the colonial experiment, this idea of independence fails? But there's also kind of an underlying idea that the colonies weren't sophisticated enough to self-govern anyway. So there are people who make an argument and say, well, are they really capable of it? Are they intelligent enough? Do they have the necessary skills? Again, kind of using the backdrop behind me as an example, when we see Parliament sit today, or that the Prime Minister gives a speech, or you see the royal family or something on television, a lot of what governs this country is tradition, history. And that's something that when a new government starts, you don't have that precedent. You don't have those historical antecedents to help guide a new government. It's all kind of getting made up on the fly. And a lot of people are worried. Do they have the ability to do this? Also, the idea of a broader representative democracy without a king, without a focal point, that constitutional monarch, has never been tried before. So a lot of people are fearful of what this ultimately is going to mean. That's a great answer. What else?
It wasn't that bad.
Yeah, we kind of complaining about nothing. That things could be a whole lot worse. Absolutely. And there are some deep concerns about what that worst could look like because of the revolution. For instance, there's a great fear that with revolution, you're going to have a disruption to trade. And that lack of trade with the North American colonies is going to not just be detrimental to a couple of fat cats with big bucks, but also to regular people. If you can't get the resources from North America to your factory in England, the people working in that factory aren't going to have jobs. They're not going to be able to feed themselves. They're not going to be able to take care of their families, housing, all of those basic necessities. But also, we have to think about the fact that the American colonies are quite dependent on the trade with Britain because a lot of goods and services that are needed to support the colonies are coming out of here. So economic disruption, that chaos is extremely important. And there's another thing to kind of keep in mind too, and that is England's a big, powerful country. Great Britain is one of the world's most powerful countries. You're taking on a huge power. And is that something you're willing to do? Now, for the British, it's also a question of whether they can afford to lose this war, because there would be a huge amount of embarrassment that would come for them if they lose this conflict. So we've got imperial prestige as a really, really important idea. So if we think about these pro and con ideas, we have to remember that those exist on both sides of the Atlantic. There are going to be people in both areas that are articulating this viewpoint. Those in the colonies and those in Britain, they're going to say, yes, this is a good idea, and yes, we should think about how we give these colonies independence and self-governance. And there are also going to be people saying this is going to be a total disaster. This is a complete train wreck. This is economically disastrous as well, and we can't allow this to happen. So one of the people who articulates this is a man named Charles Inglis. And all of you should have had a chance to read that document that Mr. Garrett gave you. Did you guys do that?
Got one honest one.
Okay, I understand. So what does Mr. Inglis say? What's his argument? What are some of the points he raises?
He said that it's a lot of America's fault that we're in such a bad situation in the first place.
Yeah, he's not particularly favorable to the colonists. I think he kind of says some of it is the colonists are being a little bit snarky and that they're griping about things maybe they shouldn't gripe about, but then particularly the French and Indian War was extremely costly, and that we have to take some ownership and responsibility for that cost. Absolutely. What are some other things that he says?
Not everybody at once.
I can't see you anymore, son. I'm assuming you're all raising your hands feverishly.
Come on.
Does he
What else
think
did he
it's going to
say?
be an easy war?
No.
Britain's one of
No. One thing that we have to really think about is that when we talk about particularly these, wars that happened centuries ago, we talk often about the leaders. We talk about the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons and the Samuel Adamses. What we forget is there are an awful lot of people that are on the front lines in these conflicts. A lot of men are going to die on the battlefield. A lot of people are going to be displaced through the destruction of property. Men, women, and children are going to suffer, and men, women, and children are going to die. There will be a cost in human life. And Inglis says that that's a price that maybe they don't want to pay. And that's a really important idea to remember, is that there is a human cost. As we talk about politicians and policy setters, those people are removed from the conflict. But Inglis wants us to remember that not everybody is physically removed from the conflict. What else does he talk about?
He says how basically without Britain, everything would just go crazy. Like saying how they depend on Britain for so much, how would it work without it?
Yeah, the chaos factor. That's a really big fear for Inglis. He believes that England is the stabilizing force, and that without British influence in the colonies, and most importantly, the prestige of being part of the British Empire, that nobody can predict what's going to happen next. And that's really key to keep in mind, is that there's a big unknown here. Now, I think we can say, 200, almost 250 years later, it was a pretty good gamble on the part of people like Washington and Jefferson and Madison. And that we've created quite a dynamic and powerful country that's come out of the revolution. Nobody knew that 250 years ago. And they were really fearful of what the consequences were going to be for a revolution of this type. And that's again, it's the fear of the unknown that often drives a lot of our decision making and things like that. So, what do you think the consequences are for the revolution for Britain itself?
Say louder, Madeline.
They lost money.
Sorry, say that again.
They lost money.
They lost money. No, absolutely. There's a huge financial issue here. Wars are expensive. Wars are not just going to cost, pounds in the case of the British currency. They're also going to cost human life. The transportation of soldiers across the Atlantic is extremely expensive. They have to be fed, they have to be housed, they have to be clothed. All of these things have to take place, and that costs a huge amount of money. It's going to be absolutely pivotal to how the British see their own economic vitality. So that's absolutely key. Do they have the money to spend? Britain's growing as an imperial power. The American colonies are not the only colonies that they have, and so you end up fighting a war that jeopardizes the stability of the entire empire just to save a portion of the empire. I'm putting my headphones in so I can hear you guys a little bit better, I think. So no, that's hugely important. Okay, I'm going to actually show you guys. The camera crews are starting to show up. There's okay, yeah. We've got about 5 minutes before the camera crews start to set up for the nightly news. But it's important, yeah, the economic disruption is going to be extremely important. What's also going to happen for Britain is it's going to cause an identity crisis. The British have got to decide, they're going to lose this war. What does that mean for a huge imperial power? You don't lose a conflict to the North American colonies. I mean, that's kind of embarrassment. Equated to the idea of Northwest Shoals, I'm moving right now while we talk. Equated to Northwest Shoals had a football team, and they played the University of Alabama and won. It's kind of silly to even think about that idea, but that's probably not a terribly strange comparison point between the idea of the American colonies beating the British on the eve of the American Revolution. It's a David and Goliath style story. And so for the British to lose is also losing a lot of face. I mean, this is a conflict that they just shouldn't lose. And it's quite an embarrassment to even think about the idea of losing their North American colonies to an upstart, untrained military. So that's going to be absolutely key. The other argument that's going to occur in Britain at the end of the revolution is actually going to be far more philosophical too, which is if wars are expensive and if political domination and military domination of places like the North American colonies is not possible, should they just get out of the imperial game altogether? Is it better to just say, well, let's not worry about having an empire. Let's just trade with anybody we want to trade with and make money. So if the North American colonies are one of England's biggest trading partners in 1776, who do you think the United States will have as its single biggest trading partner in the year 1800?
Basic.
Great Britain.
Yeah, they go right back to doing exactly what they were doing before. If your biggest trading partner was Britain before the revolution, it's not terribly surprising that right after the revolution, you would reestablish all of those economic relationships. And so that idea of maybe we don't need to have a political domination of North America or a military domination of North America if we have an economic domination in North America, then why should we spend all that money to defend them? Let them defend themselves. Let them govern themselves. We'll just make money. And so for really over 50 years, the British are going to focus much more on economic expansion of their empire than they are political and military expansion of the empire. Now that's going to change in the 1850s with their domination of India, and they're going to find that just economic relationships don't quite work, especially when these huge mega companies that they will establish, things like the British East India Company, are going to have their own armies and they're going to have their own kind of bureaucratic establishments. And so when those companies start getting into political and military scrapes, then the government's going to have to come in and take over. And that ultimately is going to change the policy for the expansion of the British Empire into much more of a political empire that it'll grow into throughout the rest of the 19th and into the 20th centuries. But the American Revolution does have a big impact on how the British see themselves and how they relate to the rest of the world. It's absolutely key to understand that. So if we think about the American Revolution then as obviously an inspirational event around the world, especially as we look at the ideals of the Enlightenment, we see it having an impact on other revolutionary movements, you know, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and others. And we see that rhetoric continuing even into the 21st century, that it's not difficult to justify studying the American Revolution, especially in your classes, but also not really difficult to justify studying it around the world. But we want to think about it in a much more complex way. It can't just be a very simple pro-revolution or anti-revolution sentiment and assume that everybody on either side of the Atlantic held very similar views. What we find is that there's actually a pro-revolutionary movement here in Britain, and in many ways they're going to use that rhetoric when it comes time to advocate for the franchise for women. They're going to use that rhetoric of the American Revolution during something called the Chartist movement in the early 19th century that will lead to greater expansion of the franchise for people all over England, Wales, and Scotland. And so the American Revolution has an impact over and over and over again. So, with that being said, Mr. Garrett, we still have a few minutes, don't we?
Yes, about 10.
Okay, well, I'll open it up to questions. I can't see you guys, but so you guys will just have to speak up. I'll let Mr. Garrett be the MC. If need be.
Not just about this, about anything.
You got a chance. I'm standing here in England. Ask me some questions.
What's it like to drive on the other side of the road?
Well, I will tell you this. I have driven here before. It's been many, many years since I drove here. It's weird, I'll tell you that. It does feel a little strange at the beginning. But there's something about being on the opposite side of the car, on the opposite side of the road, that actually makes it feel kind of normal. It's a little, what's weird here, I'll tell you, is the strangest thing about driving in Britain, roundabouts. They're everywhere. They don't have traditional intersections like we do at home. And so you have to kind of learn how to navigate the roundabout. And there's this whole kind of roundabout culture of which lane you're supposed to be in and when you signal, that I have to say, as a North American driver, I have not figured out. One thing that's really good for me, though, is being in a city like London where there's a huge public transportation network. I don't have to drive. So I'm not forced to drive a car here. I ride the bus and I use the underground and the trains pretty frequently. So it's kind of nice. I can sit and play on my phone, play a game or solitaire or check Facebook or something like that. And I can get pretty much any place I need to go. And some of the noise you've been hearing behind me have actually been the buses passing by. So that's why it's kind of noisy where I am.
All right, Madeline has a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does the toilet flush the opposite way there?
Now, toilets flush the same way here as they do. Now, I will tell you one thing that's different. You know, in the US, we have a handle on the side of the tank, and here there's a button in the top.
Some people.
And if you look, toilets always have a button.
Hey, listen. Toilet's gonna be
All right.
silent, apparently.
Next question.
Who's next? Anything?
Usually like.
Abby?
Yeah. What's the weather like there right now?
The weather right now actually is kind of chilly. It's in the 60s, and so as you can see, I'm wearing a coat, and I'm gonna probably need to wear something a little warmer in about an hour when the sun goes down. I would say an English summer is a lot like kind of March in Alabama. It is not. They had a really hot summer this year, and one day it got up to 90 degrees, and this whole country kind of came to a standstill. And I said, you know, for a boy from Alabama, 90 degrees is just getting the summer started. But yeah, the weather here is a lot cooler. It does rain a fair bit. That's the biggest thing. And in the wintertime, when you're here, if you wake up in the morning and it's like 50 degrees, it's going to be 50 degrees all day, and it's going to be cloudy all day. There's kind of a constant cloud cover from about November to March. So that's probably the biggest difference. But today, I'd say for us, it'd be a little chilly. It's in the 60s, and I'm in a wool, kind of a thick wool jacket.
And it's about 5 o'clock?
Yeah, we're coming up on 5 o'clock, so it's about time. One reason why I had to move was because the news stations are starting to set up for the nightly news. And they'll do live broadcast from this spot here at the Houses of Parliament. And yeah, so rush hour is about to start. And since it's Friday afternoon, yeah, everybody's going to be getting ready for the weekend.
What's your
As am I.
What's your food that you like to eat there?
Now, my favorite British food is something called bangers and mash, which is sausage and mashed potatoes with gravy over it, which might sound a little gross, and it doesn't exactly look super appetizing, but it's actually really good. The English eat a lot of really hearty foods, lots of potatoes and sausage, and lamb is very good here. Now, the neat part about living in London is that London is a city of about 8 million people. And there are almost 300 languages spoken just in this city alone. And every one of those language groups has some kind of, oh, now I'm seeing you guys again.
Okay, and we can't see you,
okay.
so.
You can't see me, okay. Let me figure out how to make that work. I think it has to do, hang on just a second. I think it has to do with power. Let's see.
Oh, well.
We're going to switch. Well, just a second. I'm going to switch back to a power source and see if that happens. I'm trying to learn about all this technology.
I understand.
So, hang on just 1 second. I'm going to turn this so that I can see about going back to. Oh, no.
By the way. Hey. You got one?
Can you guys see me yet?
No.
There we go.
There we go.
There we go.
All right, Abby's got a question for you.
Can you speak in a British accent?
So I think there's a question. I was talking about food. So yeah. Oh, yeah. We spoke about this in a second. No, everywhere you go, there's like Ethiopian food and Lebanese food and Indian food. Any country you can think of in their cuisine, they have it here. So that makes it actually a really great place to eat. So what was the question about British accents?
Can you speak in one?
Can I speak in one? No. It would be thoroughly embarrassing for me and also for all the people around me. Now, what you will find, I will say this, if you're here long enough, I don't think you develop a British accent, but what you do is you pick up the vocabulary. So like I find myself saying the British words for things that I would not use that same word at home. And so you do find yourself kind of adopting the vocabulary here, but you don't really adopt the accent. I haven't given up my Southern accent. I'm pretty proud.
Eli?
What else?
What's your favorite part of history?
My favorite part? Well, I studied the 19th and 20th centuries, so I'm actually would be considered a modernist. But if I really had to be honest, my favorite part of English history is the English Reformation, the Tudors. Today is actually the birthday of Elizabeth I. But Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, that's probably the most interesting to me, but it's not the specific area in which I study. I also love Russian history too. I love the Russian Revolution. I also like the bad people in history. I have a tendency to make those my favorite, are the ones that people don't like. I just recently visited the tomb of Richard III, who was the king of the Inns of the War of the Roses. And if you want to read more about him, read the Shakespearean play. He really is a jerk in that. You know, the idea that he maybe even murdered his wife and children, he murdered his nephews. And I'm like, no, that's one of my favorite people to study. I like the ones that always have a background.
I'm sorry, I like learning about this.
Any other questions?
Like,
One more?
I love Final Destination.
We've got probably time for one more.
Anybody?
All right, Macy.
Did you go to Wimbledon if you were there?
I have been to Wimbledon before. It's been a couple of years. And I did get to go. I took my brother-in-law, who grew up in Sheffield. He was a tennis player at UNA. And I took him to Wimbledon when he visited me when I lived here as a student. The neat thing about Wimbledon is if you don't get the tickets, because tickets to go to the major stuff is pretty expensive. But you can go at 5 o'clock in the evening, and people who have turned their tickets back in, you can get them for £10, which is about $13, $14, and then you can spend the rest of the evening watching. So I got to watch a lot of doubles matches when I was there, and saw like the big players from when I was a kid, people like Martina Navratilova, and some of the commentators like Billie Jean King. I got to see them when I was there, but yeah. But they follow it. Now, one thing that's really cool here is because, obviously Wimbledon's a huge sporting event for the British. They'll set up big screens in the parks, and people will bring lawn chairs and blankets and sit in the park and watch the day's coverage and be out in the sunshine. And that's kind of a fun way to watch it instead of watching it at home on TV. Because you get to watch it on a screen that's 20 feet high. All right. Is that about it?
That's it. We appreciate it.
All right, well, it was great talking to you. I hope the live thing worked as well. So anybody who actually watched this live through the College of Arts and Sciences page, it was nice to talk to you too. And hopefully I'll have a chance to visit your class in person pretty soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.